My name is Sonny. I'm the COO of ABC Florida East Coast. Welcome to episode 26 of the Obvious Podcast.
And I'm Peter Daiga. I'm the president and CEO of Associated Builders and Contractors Florida East Coast chapter. Welcome, everybody.
The Obvious Podcast is a production of ABC Florida East Coast. Unless otherwise stated, all content reflects the opinions of the guests and the hosts, which is us.
And if you like the Obvious Podcast, and why wouldn't you, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms such as Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, and Spotify, among others, or watch the audio-visual version on YouTube. You can also follow the Obvious Podcast on Instagram, X, and Truth Social. You can always reach out to us via email at theobvious@abceastflorida.com. Links to all the social media feeds are in the episode show notes. And if you want to help others find the podcast, and we hope you do, please leave us a review on your podcast platform of choice. So here we are, Sonny.
You know, when we first started this journey together,
Yeah.
I really didn't know how long this would last or how long we would have material to talk about, but
Well,
God is good.
it's good.
You know?
People seem to like the podcast. We get a lot of positive feedback. The audience is growing. The followers are growing. So
And we certainly appreciate you all watching and listening and sharing your perspective and your views with us and with your friends and family about this show.
Yeah. Who knows where this will evolve to? Maybe one day we'll have call-ins.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. Yeah.
Praise us or whatever.
Yeah, well, they're insulting us. We're going to just bleep it out. So today, I wanted to talk to you about something that's near and dear to my heart. Well, two things that are near and dear to our hearts. One is you and I are both huge fans of meritocracy, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
And the second is construction. So we figured, why not marry them both and talk about the power of meritocracy in construction? There you go.
It's like ABC.
It's like
in a nutshell,
ABC.
You know? I love it.
Right?
Yep. I love the subject, and I can't imagine we'll have any difficulty filling 20 minutes.
We won't have any issues with that. I know we talk a lot about ABC being merit shop, right? And I would love for you to tell our audience what that means. What is a merit shop? What makes ABC distinctive and unique in its perspective on how it looks at the market?
Sure. Well, meritocracy, I think, and I'm going to do my best to just give you a simple definition, right? It's like a people's merit. Let me even back up more. I mean, I think this is so in tune with the principles, the values of Martin Luther King.
Yep.
You know, for example, about being judged on the content of your character as opposed to the color of your skin. And meritocracy, and certainly the way ABC defines it, just kind of expands that a little, I think, you know, in that the industry and who you choose, whether you be a private provider or government, although obviously being private, we feel there's little role for government dictating those relationships.
Right.
But we think the value should be the same. But certainly we get more involved when it comes to public work. You know, should be based on nothing other than the merit of that company.
Well, hold on, before you go on, let's tell our audience what public work is.
Well, public work where you have a public owner, so it might be a government entity at the federal, state, or local entity. You know, I would say so. They're
Construction for
building schools, or sewer system,
airports,
wastewater system. Who knows? Airports,
roads.
you know, maybe even sporting venues or stadiums or ballparks. You know, where the local government is involved in funding it. Anything where, you know, and again, this is from a government affairs perspective, a matter of interpretation, but some of the laws will be if a single dollar is involved, you know, whereas other parts of the law will be the whole thing has to be funded by the federal, by a government entity.
Right.
So, but generally it's considered, you know, any mix of funding, you know, and a lot of times projects are mixed, you know, like, I don't know, sporting venues come to mind, you know, it might be a mix of things.
Public-private partnerships, things like that.
Sure, absolutely. So, but the idea is, you know, certainly when it comes to taxpayer dollars, we believe we should be very engaged in making sure the government stays out of, you know, there's a popular phrase coined in the last decade or so by different right-of-center politicians about the government shouldn't be in the business of picking winners and losers, right? That's not their business. You know, so what
When
they
do a terrible job.
Yeah, generally, you know, so yeah, I think for us, meritocracy means, you know, contractors' ability to perform the work, having a record in many cases. We understand government wants somebody with a record, although that can sometimes be a conflict, right? Government, on the one hand, says they want a diversified field of contractors that can do work. But then if they say you have to have a record of work, well, how do you get started? So there's always that chicken and egg, kind of conversation. But in general, meritocracy is, it shouldn't matter what zip code you're from, which we fight every once in a while. It shouldn't matter whether you're a union or non-union, which is kind of the basis of ABC's founding back in 1950. There's a bunch of what we coined the term merit shop contractors. In other words, their commonality was not the fact that they were union contractors. Their commonality was they felt like they had to compete based on merit. I could do a better job performing this work than you can, and so give the job to me.
Right.
And I've got the ability to be bonded and insured and have a reputation of completing the work and all that stuff. Those are meritorious things that ought to judge who wins work.
Right.
Not what zip code you're from or the color of your skin, to use Martin Luther King's, but the content of your character, which again, for us, the content of a character of a company, is, can you perform the work? Do you have the insurance? Do you have a reputation and a track record of performing the work? So anyway, not to belabor the issue.
No, that's a great explanation. So I want to ask you a question. What do you think in the U.S. now? This is a national number. What percentage of construction workers are in non-union shops?
Well, I know. I think the exact number. And by the way, this is something that, when I came to work for ABC 26 years ago, and even to this day, I recently came back from facilitating another chapter's annual leadership conference
In Michigan, right?
retreat in Michigan, Southeast Michigan.
How did that go?
It was spectacular. The leader, the chapter president, Keith Ledbetter of that chapter, and his staff are amazing.
Yeah.
I was very impressed, as is his leadership. And this is a commonality, I think, across successful chapters. They have that right combination of staff leadership and, volunteer leaders.
Right.
And smaller than us, both the chapter and their education trust. But if you look at the tenure that he's been there, you see all the metrics trending up.
Yeah.
Financial success.
He's a great leader. He's a great leader.
Membership growth, enrollment, and whatnot, and especially what they're doing from an education side has been unbelievable. The facilities that they've been able to purchase and build out, and the quality of the facilities. So they have the same challenge. I think almost everywhere universally has this challenge of perception in the public, whether it's the public or government officials, on what percent, and they generally perceive it to be much greater than it is.
Yeah.
And so it's a challenge I think we all face, in trying to educate people. So part of the reason we're doing this episode is because I think ABC issued a press release based on new data that was just out on the percent of the construction workforce that was unionized, and the AP picked up on it.
Yeah.
So we wanted to, since the AP picked up on it and published this.
Got a lot of coverage.
Got a lot of coverage.
Yeah.
The reason it got coverage is because, do I go ahead and, to answer your question?
Yeah.
So at the lowest record since the government's been keeping records, which I think it was a 89.7, I think, nationwide.
9.7. That's you nailed it on the head perfect.
So about 10% of the 89.7 is merit-based.
It's merit-based.
So
non-union construction.
Non-union construction. So only about 10% nationwide. The reason I brought up Southeast Michigan is because they're above the average. We're below the average in Florida, so we're only 3%.
3% non-union in Florida.
3% union.
I'm sorry, 3%.
97% merit shop in Florida. And it's been 3 or 4% for pretty much my whole tenure working for ABC. And I even talked about in Michigan, about some of our tactics, in the past. Going to Tallahassee, we had the 1 year or maybe a couple of years buttons made that said 97-3.
So they would ask.
And that's all it said.
So,
so walking the halls, people who had nothing to do with, just people in general, and legislators would ask you, what's with the 97-3? And it opened up a conversation to start to counter perceptions.
Yeah.
Because people are stunned when they realize in Florida it's only 3% unionized. They think it's 60, 70, 80, honestly, I think.
So why do you think workers are not choosing unions? I mean, they can go, right? I mean, it's easy to go to a union and be like, hey, I want to become a member. They'll take your check. And
That's right. In a state like Florida, that's a right to work state, there's, any state, there's nothing prohibiting a group of employees from unionizing. It's quite the opposite. Non-right to work states make it very difficult to choose not to. But in a right to work state, in most states in the country, it's.
I'll tell you, for somebody that's 10% of the workforce, they have some beautiful buildings in D.C. I've walked by the, I think it was the electrical workers. Their building is right downtown.
Yeah.
It's gorgeous.
So, yeah, for sure. So, why that's the case? I mean, we could probably spend, do a couple shows on that, and certainly more than 20 minutes. But, I just think I like to believe that most people want to be kings of their own destiny. Is that the way of saying this, or they want to
Masters
masters
of their own domain.
Domain and destiny. They feel like they don't need to be part of a union in order to negotiate the very best terms for them. Now that's people who know they're going to succeed and work hard, and they, I think, are going to fall in that category. And the irony is, I don't know if you've thought about this. What are the areas that you think of when you think of high unionization these days?
I think of government workers.
Government workers.
First thought, and teachers.
So,
and I think teachers.
Professional athletes, they're unionized. Good grief. Do they really need a union?
I didn't know that. Really?
Oh, yeah. All professional athletes are unionized. How about, like pilots? Pilots are unionized.
Yeah.
Do they really need a union? Or they, the point I'm trying to make is it seems like today in our culture in America, the most unionized sectors are these organizations where they're already very highly paid.
Right.
It's not a matter of, high wages.
Right. Yeah, it's not
the athletes they're negotiating, what kind of access to, I don't know, workout equipment, or I don't know what they're negotiating, further. Anyway. Yeah, I think it's a positive sign in our culture that, today nationwide it's, about 10%, 3% in Florida. And again, when I was in Michigan, they're above the average. I think they're about 15%. But this is Michigan.
Probably because of the auto industry, right?
Well, this is just construction we're talking about, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Right? These things are just construction. But, even in a heavy unionized state like Michigan, which is perceived to be that mostly because of the auto industry. I think most people are just stunned to find out only 15% of the construction workforce is unionized.
Wow.
So anyway, I think it's positive news as a culture, when we're working and we're now at the lowest rate possible. So
I think one of the biggest reasons,
the lowest rate recorded in a few years.
So what I find interesting is that according to this data from the ABC report, which AP picked up on, last year union membership amongst construction workers dropped by 38,000 members. That surprised me. Right? And that tells me that those guys and gals are ready to compete on a bigger, better scale, right? Because if you have, the whole idea is that, our industry, like most industries, really do thrive on competition, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're talking about being cost effective, being safe, being efficient, delivering, as you like to say, delivering projects faster, safer, and on time and on budget, you really have to hire the best and the brightest. And the only way you're going to hire the best and the brightest is obviously pay them,
absolutely,
right? Give them the right opportunities and allow them to grow and succeed and flourish. And
the reality is, I think the workforce wants to be judged on their performance.
Correct.
Their skill, their work ethic. Not
most of human nature. Right?
Absolutely.
That's most of human nature.
Absolutely. Not on seniority,
right?
Or union rules or membership or whatnot.
Yeah.
So.
I remember in one of my econ classes in college, they talked about the freeloader problem, right? So you have the productive people and the less productive people. And then the productive people will eventually turn and resent having to compensate or carry partially the burden for the less productive people. That sort of inevitably happens, right? And in law school, there's a class, and when you take property class, one of the first lessons you learn is that you read this essay, and it's called The Tragedy of the Commons, where, and this is kind of related to this, where you're talking about if you have a piece of land and you tell a village that they own it, nobody's going to take care of it, right?
Yep.
But if you cut it up and you give it to individuals and you tell them you own it, it's much different reaction to how people react to.
Yeah. This is basic, right?
Basic,
I don't know, economics.
Yep.
You know, and
But it seems to be lost on lawmakers these days.
Yeah, but there's, I think to your point, there's a connection though between unionization and merit shop versus, you know, like if you look at the most dirty parts of the public, it's not going to be properties like ours that's owned by a corporation or somebody's house. You know, it's going to be the right of way. It's going to be the side of the highway. It's going to be the parts that are owned by government where nobody's responsible. You know, that are going to be the dirtiest and the least well kept, and you know.
I mean, I was late to The Sopranos. I don't know if you've ever seen that show, but being a union construction worker, it's a joke in that show. Like it's this idea of, I mean, literally one of
That's Hollywood.
That's
representing
Hollywood
it.
representing it. I mean, there's literally Sopranos, Tony Soprano's guy, and it's an old reference, and I get it, but I saw this show much later after it came out. There's literally characters from the show that are part of his crew that go and just sit at the job sites, don't do anything, you know, because they're part of the union, and they get paid, and they talk about this, and everybody's aware of it, like.
Right.
You know.
So let's tie that in because I do want to, you know, talk a little bit about my experience over the years and even still today, maybe a little less so in Florida because of our 97.3.
Yeah.
But more so in other parts of the country that the government is involved in picking winners and losers when it comes to union. We have a thing called project labor agreements, different areas throughout the country. I remember, you know, there was a couple times in our history at the chapter when the Marlins ballpark was being built or some airport expansion and whatnot. And because of the perception that people have, which is why correcting this perception is so important, because of the perception policymakers and elected officials have, you know, they want to like set aside these quotas for unions, like 50% of the work or even higher, you know, has to go to unions. But when
that's what a PLA is.
That's what a PLA in essence is saying. In order to do this work at all, so like if you put a PLA, project labor agreement, on this project, you're basically saying you have to agree. You have to either be a union or agree to the union terms or be a signatory to the union in order to do the work. So they're in essence knocking out 90% of the Florida workforce at that point.
Right.
You know, so it's more obvious maybe in Florida how that's detrimental, you know, to the construction, because what are you going to get when you knock out 97%? You're probably going to get higher prices. You're going to get a lot of out-of-state unions coming in to do the work as opposed to local work, which generally elected officials are very interested in local.
Right.
You know, so but if you have this perception that 70 or 80% of the workforce is unionized when it's only 3%, that's an issue. So this is not maybe quite as big an issue in other places like Michigan, but still it's only 15% there.
Well, you just made a really good point, but super fast. So I'm gonna go back to that point and slow down a little bit. So let's imagine a scenario where there's contracts available for the Marlins Stadium, just for the sake of a conversation.
Soccer one coming up. Let's talk about
the soccer stadium coming up, right? And you have to have a certain percentage of your construction force be a union. Now, in Florida, where 3% of construction workers are union, that's a small pool of candidates that would qualify. So your point is, because it's a smaller pool of candidates, they can come in and charge significantly more, because that small pool of 3% of union workers don't have to compete with 97% of non-union workers. So the cost to the taxpayer goes up, and inevitably there's an impact on quality and on time and how well the project does, because you have a smaller pool of people that costs you more and takes a longer amount of time.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So that's really, I know ABC National and us as a chapter, we really fought hard on the PLA, which the Biden administration pushed really hard. There were lawsuits.
On a lot of DOD, you know, work on, bases and whatnot. And again, not all states are created equal in that. There are more bases and larger bases with work being done in other parts of the country. Right. Florida, but still, we had to face it, and we're a unit, we're a team, right? And ABC is founded on these principles of the merit shop. Again, you know, the work ought to be decided not on whether you're a union or not, or whether you're from a certain zip code even, quite frankly.
Yeah.
You know, it ought to be based on, are you qualified? Is your company capable of doing that work? Do you have a track record of doing successful work? And then can you be bonded and insured? And
Well, thankfully, the PLA mandate has gone away under this new administration.
It does, again, local governments still sometimes try.
Yep.
It's something that ABC I can remember from day one and even to this day are fighting and fight around the country to just, again, why it's so important to correct perceptions, because if you don't understand.
Lawmakers know if you put this, all you're doing is shrinking the pool of your available competitors, which inevitably will lower quality and drive up cost.
Yeah.
It's basic economics.
Yeah. Merit, in a way, is another way of just describing a true free market.
Yeah.
Right, if you will. I mean, it's decisions ought to be based on, well, first off, having decisions based on merit and or free markets means you're going to get more innovation, you're going to get better products, because you're free not to use those people if they're bad or they produce a poor product or a poor service. And that system has built-in mechanisms to encourage people to improve.
Right.
Because if you don't, you're not going to survive. You're not going to prosper. You're not going to make good profits.
And you know what that point reminds me of, and it's a longer quote from Milton Friedman. Thank you. It was a Milton Friedman quote. That people who don't like each other will do business together because it's in their best interest.
That's right.
Right?
That's great.
And so this idea of, I don't even have to like you, but if you're offering me the better product at the better price with the better terms, I'm going to do business with you.
And what's the exact opposite of that? Crony capitalism.
Crony capitalism.
Doing business with people just because you like them or just because they're...
Or they're good for your politics or they're good for your politics.
Back to the principles of Martin Luther King, which are,
don't
the
judge me by
content of
that.
your character, the content of your company, the
Exactly.
quality of the work you're producing, not something superficial that really has no pertinence to that. So anyway, and it also saves taxpayers money, right? I mean, meritocracy and hiring based on those things, again, because you're going to be encouraging competition, is going to get you the best product and more of the product. Well, let's say we're talking about building schools. Would you rather have the extra student stations for the same price, or would you rather pay more?
Pay more to the guy
To
who
have
built it.
fewer, So you're gonna be saving the taxpayers money, and it generally helps the economy. So,
Absolutely.
any event, good news coming out this week from ABC, picked up by the AP. Unionization in the construction workforce is at an all-time low of 89.7%.
And meritocracy is on the rise.
Meritocracy on the rise, and you want to know what? ABC had a large part in that success and that continued march. So anyway, thanks for being part of it.
Yep. Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this episode. We look forward to seeing you again soon.
For comments, send us an email at theobvious@abceastflorida.com. Until next time, ciao.